بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
About knowledge dissemination or of a subject that is essentially an ocean. So to cover a lot of subject within the 1 hour, of course, would not do it justice, but definitely just a little dab in the ocean to give a kind of flavor of what is the potential of this industry, which today stands at around $2.5 trillion globally. As per the sources, international sources, for example, Refinitiv is one of the contemporary sources that is quoting that around 2018-19 was in the range of $2.5 trillion of Islamic assets globally, which is a Thomson Reuters company. Apart from that, basically what I will be able trying to explain is that before we delve into the subject of Murabaha or Riba, uh, I would like to kind of just give a broad overview of classification, the product classification, how Islam views them, and on what basis have these been classified to broad a kind of a product suite. And it draws essentially it draws essentially from the background of knowledge based on two very big scholars from where I've derived all these material is largely first and foremost is Justice Taqi Usmani for certain material, and secondly it draws heavily from on basis of Dr. Hussain Hamid Hassan, who you may be knowing is I also consider him as one of my mentors. I have had the privilege of working with him at Emirates Islamic Group Islamic Bank. He's truly a scholar. I call him not to call him a mentor what would be an injustice, perhaps call him the master mentor or Ustaz Azam, basically, essentially. So basically, I've had the privilege to learn from his august company. That's how I mean. So on that basis, let's commence. First, I'll try to give a broad overview of how the products are classified as Islamic products. These have been classified on basis of multiple methodologies. I'll just give you three classification in three aspects of it. First and foremost, Sharia views these Islamic contemporary Islamic products, the popular ones that everybody knows, Murabaha, Salam, Ijara, Istasna, Mudarba, Musharaka, on basis of two broad classifications. What are those two broad classifications? These are viewed on basis of sale contracts, first classification, and secondly on basis of investment contracts. So that's what products fall under the purview of sale contracts. First and foremost is Murabaha, which is the cost plus profit sale contract. Second is Salam, which is sale of a described commodity. Third sale contract is Ijara, where there's a sale of a usufruct, which is based on a certain asset. Istasna, it is essentially a sale of described asset based on certain preconditions. Secondly, we fall in the domain of investment contracts. Investment contract essentially could be a mudarba, which is commonly used in the field of fund management. It could be a musharaka, which is essentially a joint venture partnership. Third would be a wakala, which is essentially an investment agency. These fall within the domain of investment contracts. And amongst these, you could be having hybrid structures that are classified with part of a sale contract and part of an investment contract. For example, we talk about sukuks. That could be or certain Islamic fund structures that are there. So this is one way of describing them. Second way could be on basis of an asset financing or liabilities side financing. Within the asset would be the musharaka or mudarba or ijara or salam area. Third could be the deposits. We are looking at it from a financial institution's perspective here. This is not directly a Sharia contract. We're talking in typically in a financial institution scenario. You could be on the liability side or a deposit side. You could be have a mudarba arrangement or a wakala arrangement. So these are two broad classification when you look at it from financial institution. Within the subclassification of that, the Islamic modes could be either partnership-based products, trade-based products, or rent-based products. And within the domain of partnership, the popular ones being musharaka. Within the trade-based products, second being the murabaha or the istasna. Third being the rent-based product would be ijara or something known as the DM or the diminishing mushar. So these are the broad classifications of the Islamic products. I know it's quite of a run through, but I just wanted to give you a heads up of how the products are classified. From then on, perhaps it would be more, perhaps easier to understand or comprehend actually how products evolve and devolve into solving multiple something. That's really a kind of a solution finder. Oh, lot of a lot of financial needs of the customer. Essentially, you cannot say today, apart from the speculative element of it, which is prohibited in any way. It addresses all the essential need a human would have in the Islamic financial model. So taking it from there, we come to the very sensitive part of it, from where Islamic banking or the challenge of Islamic banking arises, which is the domain of riba. So I will basically try to explain, although even if you have a session of 1 week, perhaps that would suffice, because this is a raging debate amongst the scholars of the world, and on and off controversies with respect to riba as to being it halal or some facets of being halal or haram are there. मौलवियों का favorite subject रहा है तारीख में. Throughout this history, the scholars have been kind of debating and disputing about it. So basically, as a banker, we try to talk about it in very headline forms, just to not to tread into any controversial areas. So what I do here is that I just quote from for you certain from certain places, from certain scholars, what I have read or what is documented, and not try to put in my angle of flavor to it, because that's a really various debate. So usually by riba we mean could mean excess, increase or addition, which implies excess and compensation without due consideration. That is one definition. Uh, Secondly, it could also mean every loan that draws more than its actual amount. Historically speaking, as perhaps you may be aware, that there was a debate amongst the scholars that this petition was taken up as to that riba or interest being haram, it should be prohibited from the economy, and this petition was summoned in the Pakistan courts, and the Federal Shariat Court gave a very beautiful, comprehensive judgment with that was spearheaded largely by three judges, but amongst that, Justice Taqi Usmani was the most dominant. So basically, there's a historical judgment on interest. There's a this is a rather clear publication like this one. This talks about the historical. Amongst that, it's a comprehensive book. I'll just read out to you one or two of the definitions that are essentially there for the subject of riba in English. And the riba, which was known to be do and practiced by Arabs, was that they used to advance loan in form of dirham, a silver coin or dinar, gold coin, for a certain term, with an agreed interest on the amount of the principal advanced. This is Imam Abu Bakr al-Jassas, uh, time frame 380 after Hijri, AH. Secondly, there is the riba al-jahiliya, is a loan given for a stipulated period, a stipulated increase on the principal payable by the loanee. This is also one of the definitions. And essentially, in four places in Quran that you find broadly four places, yet you find very explicit uh, verses that talk about the riba or its prohibition. It's, if you look at it, it's a kind of a gradually progressing kind of a thing that first starts out subtly and then eventually ends up in outright condemnation of on the prohibition of riba. First revelation would be Surah Rum, in which it was said that that which you give as interest to increase people's wealth increases not with God, but that which in which you give in charity, seeking the goodwill of God, multiplies manifold. Surah Rum, verse 39. Second revelation. And for
Surah
the
Nisa.
taking, right? Yes, please.
Yeah, no, no. I'm just saying Surah Nisa, I think.
The second one is Surah Nisa. There are four broad classification. I'm talking about the four. Surah Nisa, verse 161. And for the taking interest, even though it was forbidden for them, and the wrongful appropriation and of other people's property, we have prepared for those among them, those who reject faith, in grievous punishment. That is the second one. Third
Yeah,
one, basically, third one, Surah Al Imran, verse 130 till verse 132. For believers, take not doubled and redoubled interest and fear God, so that you may prosper. Fear the fire which has been prepared for those who reject faith, and obey God and the Prophet, so that you may receive mercy. Surah Al Imran, verses 130 to 132. And the
Surah
fourth and the
Baqarah.
final, most dangerous revelation, probably
Baqarah.
according to some traditions, that is one of the last verses of Holy Quran as well, according to certain traditions of Hadith, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And those who, which talks about outright condemnation of this situation. Those who benefit from interest shall be raised like those who have been driven to madness by the touch of the devil. This is because they say trade is like interest, while God has permitted trade and forbidden interest. Hence, those who have received the admonition from their Lord and desist and keep their previous gains, their case being entrusted to God. But those who revert shall be the inhabitants of fire and abide them therein forever. God deprives interest of all blessings, charity. He loves not the ungrateful sinner. Those who believe, perform good deeds, establish prayer, pay zakat, their reward is with Lord. Neither should they have any fear, nor shall they grieve. O believers, fear Allah and give up what is still due to you from the interest if you are true believers. So basically, this is until ayat. This is I read up to ayat 277. It is till ayat 281. So it is something. Uh, Basically, what we are talking about. And moreover, I'll just quote you another one of the hadiths. Jabir bin Abdullah radiallahu anhu reported on Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam pilgrimage that the Prophet addressed to the people. All of the riba of Jahiliyyah is annulled. The first riba that are annulled is a riba that accruing to Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib, the Prophet's uncle, is being cancelled completely. So essentially talking about it, or on the prohibition of riba. Why was this done? Basically, one of the reason is that it has led so much to the degradation of societies, the destruction of societies. What is happening today in pandemic times? It is a hot topic of interest. What is essentially happening now is that people are countries that are so sunken deep into the debt, the levels of debt. What are they talking about? They're propagating. It starts from please either waive off interest or reduce our interest. Then it comes to the element of reduction of principal. But the first, because it is essentially the, you could say, the economic killer, the economy killers are the places where all these countries within individuals. I have been in the consultancy business for a while now, and if you visit any collection center, you can see the plight of people with 5 credit cards, 10 credit cards, and the way the treatment meted out to them by the collection agents is certainly something. No, it's not a very pretty sight, and of course the people are stuck on it. What is the fundamental lying there? It's not necessarily the principle. It is basically something living beyond the means, and the crisis that's expounded upon them because of the element of interest and compounded interest. This is essentially the area of interest which destroys individuals as well as society. So this perhaps we'll talk about later when we come to the subject of question answer session. This completes the subject of this. Now I come to the the subject of the product. We talk about Murabaha. In Murabaha, essentially, I will talk about uh, what is the broad definition, the parties involved, some of the conditions of Murabaha, and maybe some other certain elements of it. And perhaps that will be expounded later in the question and answer session. Is my voice clear? Is everything? I mean, are people able
It's
to
perfect.
comprehend?
It's perfect.
Okay. Okay. Coming to the thing, you can now, if you want, we can show people the slide that we were talking about a while back regarding the roles and responsibilities. How it starts off is that uh, Murabaha was essentially not designed as a financial product, although it is in the world today the most popular financial product used and abused throughout financial institutions, unfortunately. But this is the most popular, the number one financial product. It was originally designed as a trading instrument, but it landed up in the financing instrument and became the darling of the bankers. And it essentially can have two parties or can have the element of three parties as well. First would be the seller and the buyer. And third could be an agent, or the agent could be the buyer himself. Who is essentially appointed on behalf of the bank. Essentially, who would be the buyer? Buyer would be essentially your customer. So two things happen when the transaction starts. What happens essentially is that uh, customer uh, basically approaches the bank with the financing request that I am in need of a product, and basically if you would like to help me out. And then what happens is the bank purchases the goods. Yeah, yes, anything? Yeah, okay. Bank purchases the goods. Bank purchases the goods and receives the title of the ownership from the vendor. Bank makes the payment to the vendor, and the bank sells the good to the customer at a cost plus its own profit. So basically, but the bank does a trading transaction with its customer. First leg of the transaction would be a trading transaction between the exporter or the seller, and then the second leg of the transaction would be bank selling it to its customer. So two legs of the transaction. So bank sells the goods to the customer at a cost plus profit, and there are two ways that customer can repay under this arrangement, either on a spot basis or on a deferred payment basis. So if there's an element of the customer can also pay them on a lump sum payment after a prescribed period of time, or they can pay in installment. Both options are permissible in Islam. But as long as, but the most critical element being that the price has to be predetermined. In fact, there are certain prerequisites, and what constitute valid condition of sale. I'll just uh, tell you that these are some of the critical conditions of Muraba. Banker and seller discloses its cost and profit margin to the client. If it is hidden and there's element unknown, that means that transaction would be considered as not Sharia compliant. Secondly, goods should be a property having value. Something that has no value is certainly cannot be sold or purchased. Third, uh, for the bank to sell it to the customer, it should have factual possession of that property. It could be physical or constructive. But suppose you decide to buy a car and it's still to be assembled within a factory. But then Muraba is not the right product for that. transaction. You will have to wait for it till you get the whole delivered, completely built up car in deliverable form for it to be become a Murabaha transaction. There's another product related to that, but we will not go into it at the moment. Third, the sale must be specifically known and identified to the buyer. Delivery of sold commodity to the buyer must be certain and should not depend upon contingency of the chance that suppose that when Expo 2020 happens, I will sell it to you. This is something that is essentially an uncertain element. You have to be give it full clarity on this. So sale must be unconditional, and the payment terms could be either cash or a deferred payment basis. Within that, to ensure that the customer is paying the price or meeting up its commitment, you could have a unilateral promise. What would be a unilateral promise? Basically, a unilateral promise would be a promise to purchase by the customer that I bank is buying essentially for your benefit. So there should be a promise to purchase. Although the customer is not obligated to buy, but definitely on in this basis, if there's a moral obligation, and suppose any damage that is incurred in that respect, that needs to be compensated, and courts do allow that. But I mean, you were are required to purchase, and you if you reneged on your contract, so essentially that has to be compensated. So that is there. But sale of goods by the customer would be on a murabaha basis after the delivery of goods. But there is a very subtle element. Until the bank gets the products within its possession, it runs the goods of ownership and the title is not transferred. For example, you bought certain commodity, you bought a car, and the car was on the high seas. And that element, basically that car, until you delivered the car to the customer, you bank is owner of that car. And suppose for some reason that car got destroyed in the high seas, you cannot claim the compensation from your customer because you failed to deliver. Car, the risk is that on the bank. So, but to mitigate that element of risk, you should have taken out the takaful or insurance to be compensated for that. And this is how that risk will be mitigated. But you were de facto owner of the car until you handed over the possession and the car keys to the customer. This contrary to that in a conventional situation, you wouldn't care whether the car was destroyed or not destroyed. Bank, if you loaned out on behalf of the customer would be responsible whether they got possession of the car or not. This is the key difference between an Islamic transaction and a conventional being used. One of the areas to be used, this is a widely used product for car financing, consumer financing, trade financing, share financing, land purchase financing, syndication for trade purposes, and it could be under sukuk product or commodity murabaha for liquidity related products. So this is largely the product relating to murabaha, and it completes major part of my thing. And of course, subsequent things can be taken up in the question and answer session. And it's now over back to Faisal that for the next session. Thank you.